Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 130 of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, it wasn't too long ago that I saw an article on Slate.com, an online magazine, about culture and the world and history and news and so forth. And I saw this article by Nicholas Day, one of their authors, one of their writers, and the story was about babies and pointing. The article was titled, How Pointing Makes Babies Human. And the article went on to discuss how babies point at things to help them create meaning in their world and to share that experience with someone else. And reading the article, it immediately made me think of what photographers do. The fact that we use our cameras to point, to carefully and systematically say to the rest of the world, hey, look at that. So I wanted to spend a little time today in today's podcast talking about pointing and talking about sophisticated pointing, the kind of sophisticated pointing we do with our cameras, where we direct our cameras' lenses, and also a little bit about who's doing the pointing and how important that piece is. So let's just sort of quickly talk a little bit about this idea of how babies convey their sense of meaning in the world by very carefully thinking about what it is that they're pointing at. They're nonverbal. They don't have a way of communicating with words, so the basis of their language is in gesture. So their gesture is the thing that is causing them to be able to let us know, hey, this thing is interesting to me, and also to direct our attention, the adult attention, on the thing that we're trying to get them to pay attention to as well. So when we say, here's the cat, they can point at the cat and say, yes, that's a cat. So here we are, we nonverbal photographers, using this ability to carefully point at the things in the world that we find interesting, that we want other people to pay attention to. We want other people to give that same kind of interest, that same kind of attention to the things that we are wanting to point at. And it is, in fact, that same sort of nonverbal communication that allows us as photographers to show images to somebody and have them understand what it is that those images might mean, what it is that we want somebody to pay attention to. And I think in some way that's what we're up to. We're up to this sort of declarative pointing, showing something to someone else. And this idea that what we're doing is very clearly saying, this is something that I find interesting. Perhaps you'll find it interesting as well. But there's another bit to this, another bit that is related to who is pointing. The idea that what we can do as receivers of the point, receivers of the image in our case, is pay attention to who it is who's pointing. I think we can all agree that there are certain photographers, certain image makers, whose pointings, whose photographs we spend a little bit more time with. We can assume that somebody whose work we've enjoyed before is often going to point at things that we would find interesting to see over and over and over again. And I think that is another aspect of this. Who is doing the pointing and how we can deduce meaning in an image from that. Another piece is who is looking at the same kinds of things that we're looking at when somebody is pointing at them. In other words, what do photographers do to create greater interest in the things that they're paying attention to? When we see other people looking at the same thing, that thing tends to become a lot more interesting to us. And I think probably many of us, especially photographers like me who often use a camera on a tripod, have probably noticed this in our world of making photographs over and over again. Whenever I have my camera on a tripod, I often find that people come up and make a picture of the same exact thing that I'm making a picture of, primarily because their assumption is if I am making a picture of this thing with a camera on a tripod, particularly if I'm using my large format view camera on a tripod, they will get a sense that, golly, this thing that this guy is pointing at must be really interesting, and he must have found a really interesting thing to take a look at. So the sort of groupthink of pointing is also interesting. We can also see that same thing playing out in the publication and gallery exhibition world, where the more people who are pointing at that same kind of thing there are, the more likely that that kind of image making is going to be successful with a larger crowd. So one of the things that I might suggest here with this idea of pointing and carefully considering what it is that we're making pictures of is begin to think about what you're pointing at. What are you pointing at? What are you wanting someone else to be interested in? Are you truly interested in that same thing? Is that interest level that you are asking other people to devote themselves to the same interest level that you might have in that same thing? In other words, can you back up the interest you have with the photographs that you're creating of that subject? So next time you're out photographing, think about pointing. Think about the fact that what you're doing when you train your camera's lens on someone, something, or someplace, that what you're doing is pointing at that thing, asking someone else to pay attention to it in the same way that you've paid attention to it. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography.